and publicly. So feel free to use the chat function through the papers to drop in questions. I know DENEEN will say more about how we work on that. So it's my pleasure to convene the 77th annual meeting of the Southeastern Renaissance Conference. Every introduction, it seems, has to use the word unprecedented. So this is my use of it. This is not entirely unprecedented for our organization. We were founded in 1943 during a different global crisis, and specifically to meet the needs of that moment and provide ways of meeting when travel was difficult. So in some ways, you know, we're ahead of the curve, we shall say. It's really wonderful to see you. It was nice chatting just in the brief moments before launching live here. Just a couple of words, because we want to get right into the papers. I'll go over to DENEEN right after this. For those of us who are, or those of you who are checking us out via YouTube or other means who aren't familiar with the SRC, I encourage you to take a look at our website and tool around and consider joining us. Just a couple of things, two things to emphasize about the SRC that I think are of particular note. One, we publish a wonderful in-house journal, Renaissance Papers, edited by our own Jim Pierce. It's kind of hard to stand and wave, but Jim does fantastic work with the journal. And we're an associate organization of the Renaissance Society of America. So we sponsor 3 sessions every RSA as well. And also, it's just a wonderful group of people. So I hope you do check us out. Finally, before we turn over to DENEEN, I want to thank Melissa, our Secretary Treasurer, for just a tremendous amount of work this year. Helen Hull, our immediate past president, who also has done a lot of heavy lifting. And of course, DENEEN SENASI, our vice president and soon to be president of SRC, and also our host. So thank you to DENEEN and Mercer for hosting us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, DENEEN.
Okay, so thank you, Chris, and thank you all, as Helen said, for being part of this weird and wonderful ride. We're so grateful to have you with us. We've been imagining you for weeks, and it's lovely to actually see you here. I want to start with a bit of John Donne, if John Wall will permit. In The Good Morrow, Donne reminds us that love can make one little room and everywhere. And in characteristic fashion, he bends the world to the will of his lovers and collapses all that's made, as Andrew Marvell does in The Garden, to a green thought in a green shade. So it is with a green thought, full of hope and gratitude for your presence. Sorry, I'm admitting someone into the room. It's with sincere gratitude that I welcome you to this one little room with that, internet bandwidth permitting, will provide for us a room to share over the next couple of days. Had we world enough in time, sorry, 17th century poetry is just what I'm doing today, apparently. Had we world enough in time, I would have loved to welcome you here. The background behind me is not as grand as John's, but it is our North Quad, which is our old quad. And it's kind of what it looks like now that it's hot and sweaty. So perhaps you're better off as you are. I do want to talk a little bit about logistics, and I don't want to take up too much time for our presenters in this first panel that I'm also moderating. So just a couple of key ideas. We've already troubleshot one thing, and that makes me happy. Melissa, Chris, and Helen are all co-hosts with me. So should something happen to me digitally, of course, fear not. Everything should go on just as before. If you are a presenter and for some reason you are digitally, snatched away, fear not. Just log back in and we'll wait for you. And if it takes a little longer than that, we'll move on to the next presenter and then make up the time that's lost once you get back to us. I've dropped my email into chat so that you can reach out to me if you like, but those of you who already have Chris and Helen and Melissa's email in your system, feel free to reach out to them as well. If you're not presenting, of course, please do mute. And moderators will hold up a hand in time-honored fashion if time is running out, and we want to let you know that it's a good idea to sort of wrap things up. And we'll do Q&A after all the talks in the panel are done, as we normally do. And I too would just like to put in a brief plug for our first ever scholarship social hour this evening. We're so grateful to everyone involved. So I just want to list their names really quickly. It's Faith Acker, Heather Hirschfeld, Scott Lucas, Kirk Melnikoff, and Jonathan Shelley. And we hope as many of you as are able will join us for celebration of their work and conversation. Feel free to bring a libation to your screen along with snacks at that time. And that's about it. Have I forgotten anything, Chris, Melissa? Did that sound, Helen, did that sound okay? All right, well, in that case, let's go ahead and start with our first panel. Turning over my page. So our first presenter is Nick Savara. Did I do that right, Nick? Was I close? Where are you, Nick? Nick, are you here?
He just dropped and he's re-emitting right now.
Oh, okay, all right.
We're just rolling with it.
It was probably my mispronunciation of his name that made it drop. Nick, I'm gonna try again. Nick Savara.
I'm sorry, my internet cut out at 12:58, so I've just rejoined.
See, we tempted the gods. That's all right.
Oh, goodness.
Nick holds an MFA from Mary Baldwin University and has worked with the American Shakespeare Center. He's currently a PhD candidate at UGA. So Nick, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I have to read a little quickly, and losing 5 minutes is a bit of a disappointment for my schedule. So then my paper, Recentering the Forest in the Early Modern World. For many modern Americans, the woods are almost always somewhere away. Whether near or far, most people see a definite and bold line between the wilderness of the forest and wherever they live most of their lives. And in the Forest of Arden, Burnham Woods, and the other wildernesses of Shakespeare all seem to be liminal, places of freedom, lawlessness, and social fluidity. While this is certainly a tempting view of Shakespeare's forest, it hardly represents the actual early modern understanding of the forest. Within early modern literary circles, there seems to be a dominant attitude that the forest was not liminal nor antithetical to civilization, but rather central and interwoven with society, government, and the crown. Outside of the cities, thousands of citizens lived near or within wooded regions and forests. In the instructions agreed upon in Parliament for commissioners for surveying the forest, printed by Henry Hills and John Fields in 1657, there lists dozens of men across only a handful of forests who were responsible for the management of these spaces. Within these forests were cottages and highways, in addition to the rangers and woodsmen who regularly patrolled the forest. As Geoffrey S. Theus puts in Writing the Forest in Early Modern England, a sylvan pastoral nation, early modern forests and woodlands are anything but foreign to human settlement. So for many, the forests were not a deserted space, nor were they an area people had to live with, but instead the forest was the primary method of living. For these people in most of England, it seemed as though, quote, English forests were not opposed to culture and civilization. This close integration of human and forest extends into the cities of England, although it manifests in a slightly different way. So despite our modern sense of cities as antithetical to wilderness, early modern London was very much a wooden space. In Wooden O's, Vin Nardizzi explains that lumber and timber were used in everything from houses to stools to warships. And theaters, especially with their exposed wood, emerged as conspicuous fixtures in London's liberties. These giant edifices were perpetual reminders of the wooden nature of the whole world, that the foundations of cities are built on trees. The theatrical spaces, as I will discuss later, only emphasize this connection. Nardizzi explains that, quote, unlike other wooden structures in London, theaters called frequent, but not invariable, attention to themselves as woodlands in performance. The most famous instance of this perhaps being in As You Like It, with Rosalind's assertion on stage that, quote, this is the Forest of Arden. This quote creates a moment that blurs the line between stage, city, and forest in each performance. The wooden materiality of the city physically manifested this blurred unity between city, forest that is found in literature of the time. Within this theater, the prolific success of pastoral plays in the period speak in part to this urban love of the forest. The immense popularity of plays like Musidorus, The Winter's Tale, The Faithful Shepherdess, and As You Like It demonstrate the interest in recreating the forest environment and embodying it in London's wooden stages. But these plays also blur the distinction between the two spaces within the works themselves. This can clearly be seen in Act 2, Scene 1 of As You Like It, as Duke Signor's brief lamentation of the deer, here portrayed as native burghers of this desert city. For Duke Signor, the For Duke Senior, the forest itself is structured like a metropolis. The move to understand the wilderness in terms of the city is not isolated to Duke Senior, as Anna Barton explains that in fiction, quote, newcomers in the forest not infrequently project an image of the urban world with which they have been familiar upon the wild. In both fiction and on stage, cities and forests can merge, even seem to exchange identities. In other words, the literary audiences of early modern England were constantly presented with forests as cities and cities as forests. Duke Senior's identification of deer as native burghers imposes a human politicized system onto the natural world of the forest, but the comparison actually cuts both ways. As Shakespeare used political metaphors to understand the forest, many of his contemporaries used the forest as a metaphor to understand the royal court. James Howell uses the forest as a long allegory for the different nations of Europe in his work Dendrologia Dodonis Grove, or the Vocal Forest. The 1644 edition, of which includes an extended clavis relating each tree to a nation or monarch. Here we find the oak related to England, with a Caledonian oak for James, quote, so called from his birth in Scotland, called in old writers Caledonia, and, quote, the fairest branch of the royal oak for Elizabeth, the king's daughter. While Howell does not carry out this allegory to its logical ends, the clavis in particular shows a concrete connection between trees and political leaders. Furthermore, in John Manwood's brief collection of laws of the forest, he reiterates that the political heritage of the forest as intrinsic to understanding the history of these spaces. In an early unnumbered page of the document, he describes the forest as being both as hath been always accompted a franchise of such noble and princely pleasures that is not incident unto any subject of the realm to have the same, but only unto the crown. Manwood's text, a thorough document on sylvan laws in the early modern period, begins with the invocation of King Henry and King Canute and their own claims to the forest of England. For Manwood and his readers, the forest is intertwined not only with royalty fundamentally, but historically. As You Like It, whose plot is very much driven by Duke Frederick's usurpation of Duke Senior and Oliver's usurpation of his father's will, would thus be framed not as emphasizing the wild versus the court, but rather the disordered court versus the naturally ordered court of the forest. For the early modern English, the natural order that the forest preserved was the social order. The proper people ruled, the proper couples married, and the proper villains converted. A governmental authority did not simply function on a metaphorical level, but government agents enforced order in a literal sense as well. Officials known as woodwards and rangers extended the social hierarchy into an enforcement of the natural order of the woods. Both these figures were responsible for maintaining English law within the realm of the forest, acting as a sort of police force that helped preserve the sylvan space as an idealized Britain. However, the ranger's power extends beyond people and attempt to control nature itself to help craft the forest to the whims of civilization. Manwood details the oath of the ranger, writing that the ranger shall, quote, rechase and with his hounds drive back again the wild beasts of the forest as often as they shall range out of the same forest into your purlieus. He shall truly present all unlawful hunting and hunters of wild beasts of venery, as well as within the purlieus as within the forest. And those and all other offenses he shall present at the king's next court of attachments as swainmote, which shall first happen. For rangers, wildlife is something to be controlled and relegated to specific areas. Likewise, unlawful hunting of wildlife is criminal, as the creatures of the forest are part of the social hierarchy as a possession of the crown. The forest is an intentionally regulated ecosystem that reflected an imagined ideal order rather than a preserve of nature as it is. The highly ordered political nature of the forest became all the more clear in times of civil unrest. In the midst of deforestation and political turmoil, the forest repeatedly became a symbol of national authority. In an address to Parliament, James I explains that, quote, the maintenance of woods is this thing so necessary for this kingdom as it cannot stand nor be a kingdom without it. Isaac Bromwich echoes this sentiment in his accusation of one Master Curie for his negligent administration of the Forest of Dean in The Spoils of the Forest of Dean. Bromwich claims that Master Curie has, quote, dishonored the nation, cheated the state, and almost ruined the goodliest plot of shipping timber in the world. In essence, the forest became a material barometer of the nation's well-being, the wellness of the nation's soul reflected in the forest as the nation's body. This increasing tension between royalty and parliament was also expressed using the same wooden vocabulary. Jeffrey S. Theus explains that, quote, pastoral trees became a veritable catch-all for the nation's worries and were depicted in highly politicized engravings, usually with the trees and forests representing the nation itself. For instance, Theus draws attention to one engraving that implicates Oliver Cromwell in the felling of an oak, which stands for the English nation as a whole and the monarchy in particular. Both within the works of Shakespeare and without, the forest was being coded in the early modern period as not only political, but national and centralized. The Forest of Arden, then, is not a space that is meant to be an escape from the court, but perhaps more of a retreat, a reconception of the court closer to the natural order. Although the forest contained a social order that was rigorously enforced, the early modern forest was still in actuality an area that could be potentially quite dangerous. This conflicting view of nature's influence finds its way onto the stage through the struggle of women in sylvan spaces. Barton explains that quote, the frequency with which forests turn out to spell trouble for women in 16th and early 17th century plays is on the one hand quite explicable, but on the other presents a paradox. However, plays such as You Like It seem to favor the forest, on the contrary, as a safe space. Rosalind is never in any real danger in Arden, and her sexuality does not seem to be a topic of real concern. Rosalind may express anxiety when she asks, quote, what danger will it be to us, maids as we are, to travel forth so far? But the fear seems to evaporate once they actually arrive in Arden. On the contrary, Rosalind finds herself far from danger and empowered in her ability to transgress gender norms while in her disguise. In her ability to transgress gender norms while her disguise, instead of helping protect her from criminals, helps her to ensnare a husband. The strange paradox of harmless crime in theatrical forests may be best understood through the period's treatment of Robin Hood. The leader of the merry men, Robin Hood romanticized the bandit's life and became a popular figure for a wide range of political groups. Despite being a thief who used the forest as an escape from the law, Robin Hood embodies the way that early modern audiences might acknowledge the forest provided an abstract sense of crime without danger. On the early modern stage, Robin Hood's life of crime, the very thing that would make audiences think of the forest as dangerous, was being toned down and cleaned up. Anthony Munday's Robin Hood had extracted money from carefully selected travelers, mostly usurers or priests, and Johnson's Robin Hood and his band robbed no one at all. Rather than focus on the criminal aspect of this man of the woods, Robin Hood, like the forest he lived in, became connected with the monarchy. Henry VIII loved the character so much he had 2 separate surprise performances of Robin Hood and his merry men. And Robin Hood Revived, a Cavalier song written shortly after the Battle of Worcester in 1651, cast the young Charles II as Robin Hood throughout. It is this conception of Robin Hood that would be evoked when Charles tells Oliver that Duke Senior and his court live like the old Robin Hood of England, not as criminals, but as agents of order and nobility. Regardless of the historical danger of the forest, places like the Forest of Arden were presented as safe, ordered, and regal. The threat of criminal activity and lawlessness may have been present in actuality, but on page and on stage, the forest was an area of safety. But beyond simply passing over the violence and criminality of forests, early modern literature uses forests as active participants in combating chaos and disorder. Like Robin Hood stealing from the rich to give to the poor, forests were agents not only of change, but of improvement in the lives of its inhabitants and the nation as a whole. So while scholars may have identified the fluid and changeable qualities of the woods, the Forest of Arden not only changes, but improves the world around it. Certainly the forest itself is fluid and flexible, but by decentralizing humans as primary agents, the natural space of the forest becomes actively engaged in the restoration and healing of its denizens and the nation. Helga Duncan alludes to this quality in her work, where she positions the forest as a place of spiritual safety. She explains that, quote, in the aftermath of violent usurpation and spatial reformation, the sacred has been removed from settled and central places, and the forest offers a place in opposition to these changes. For the characters within As You Like It, the men are no longer trapped in the world of the carefully bounded court with its calculated spectacle and posturing, but rather in a world away from the disordered court. Duke Sr. directly alludes to this escape that Arden provides when he says, quote, "Hath not old customs made this life more sweet than that of painted pomp? Are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? Here feel we not the penalty of Adam." Not only does the forest offer a life safer than the one found at court, it offers spiritual healing, undoing that original sin of Adam. While the penalty of Adam may refer to the curse of hard labor that God lays upon mankind, it just as easily refers to the original sin itself. Here in the forest, not only are men at ease, but the damage to their souls is reversed. The forest offers both an escape and a restoration of the human person. But throughout As You Like It, the Forest of Arden does not simply hide characters from their problems, it actively works to heal them. Theus supports this in his description of early modern forests as not only places of escape or temporary refuge, instead they were ambiguous, contentious sites of change. Each of the characters is driven or flees to the forest by some problem that invariably is fixed by the forest itself. For instance, Rosalind's love of Orlando is only satisfied in the freedom the forest allows her. Arden is a place of safety that allows Rosalind pursuit outside her social class, as this daughter of the rightful Duke loves the second, rustically at home Orlando. Rosalind's familial conflict and the inciting incident of the play also finds a solution at the hands or branches of Arden. After Arden seems to magically summon up Jakes Du Bois, Duke Sr. and the rest of the court hear that Duke Frederick came to Arden and were meeting with an old religious man, after some question with him, was converted, both from his enterprise and from the world. Jakes, the advocate of the forest, seems to only underline the ecological implications of Duke Frederick's decision as he joins them in the, quote, ultimate adoption of an aesthetic way of life in this natural forest of Arden. The forest not only provided a safe place for Rosalind to solve her own problems, but interceded in preventing further conflict. Orlando's own concerns were doubly cured by the forest. His lament that Oliver has neglected to breed him well is corrected by his marriage to Rosalind, a marriage that only occurs due to the Deus ex Silva arrival of Hymen. While Hymen from heaven brought Rosalind, it is Arden that seems to provide the god himself. His second problem, his brother's plan to murder him, is equally corrected by the forest. Oliver, whose own spiritual disorder led to plotting fratricide, finds healing in the forest while sleeping under an oak. In the same scene, Oliver admits that he is completely transformed, saying, "'Twas I, but 'tis not I. I do not shame to tell you what I was, since my conversion so sweetly tastes being the thing I am." This transformation is one of the few instances of danger in a narrative, as both the lion and snake attack Oliver. The wilderness seems to defend Orlando from Oliver, who becomes a sort of wild man before being restored, but this danger is transitory. Oliver's transformation is complete and also leads to him finding a romantic partner, helping create symmetry in the triangle of Orlando, Celia, and Rosalind. Louis Montrose emphasizes this as not a matter of accident or convenience, explaining that, quote, what happens to Orlando at home is not Shakespeare's contrivance to get him into the forest. What happens to Orlando in the forest is Shakespeare's contrivance to remedy what happened to him at home. And while I have focused on As You Like It within the scope of this paper, I feel compelled to take the briefest of tangents to connect this understanding to another of Shakespeare's plays, Macbeth. Although the witches and Macbeth are often focal points of the work, casting Birnam Wood as an independent agent of change opens up the possibility of exploring the forest as tied to national identity and corrective force. Celine Savatier-Lahond explores Shakespeare's mobilization of the forest and claims that Birnam Wood, quote, has a pedigree that can be traced back to ancient times. She continues on to explain it is as if Shakespeare himself has established a connection between history and myth. Birnam Wood, closely tied to Celtic tradition and the Scottish nation, actively participates in the ousting of its evil usurper. Unlike the Forest of Arden, waiting for characters to come into its domain to fix the political corruption, Birnam rises, marches, and sieges Dunsinane to restore the natural or perhaps supernatural order. As a whole, the early modern understanding of forest is central restorative, and national at its core. Life in England was distinctly textured by this forest, whether living near or far from these wooded places. Authors throughout the period used these common experiences to articulate national identity, often through the lens of the crown. Despite all this, conventional understanding emphasizes the wilderness of the forest at the expense of all else. Rosalind's cross-dressing dominates any discussion of the societal norms and law that typically follow the forest in early modern writings. For scholars and theater practitioners exploring the early modern forest, I hope this paper will provide an encouragement to return to the roots and branch out from the casting of the forest as liminal, freeing, or simple. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry I went over.
Need some audible clapping. It's the
Yeah, I mean, we were all muted, but we were all clapping, and then we realized, and what I said was, you didn't go over, you were perfect. You were fine.
We have plenty of time.
We're
our
good.
speakers should not worry about.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
stay within your time, but don't feel stressed about it.
Thank you for going first. You were great. All right, so we're going to move on to our next speaker now. Margaret Sanders, Meg, is a graduate teaching assistant at North Carolina State University, where at present she is completing her MA thesis under the direction of our own Dr. John Wall. Meg?
Thank you so much for your introduction. I'm honored to be presenting to you today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my other colleagues as well. Thank you, Nicholas, for a fascinating paper. My own paper is titled "The House Received All Ornaments to Grace It, Cavendish, Lanier, and the Cavalier Ideal of the Bonum Vitae." The country house is a perfect symbol of idealized England, solid, imposing, and ancient, yet warm and inviting. In the 17th century, these country seats were put into poetry as metaphorical distillations of the virtues of the gentry. Many of the great poets of that century, from Ben Jonson to Thomas Carey, wrote poems in a genre that came to be known as country house poems. Many poets in this tradition are considered Cavalier poets because of their loyalty to the throne before and during the English Civil War. This category, however, is not fixed. To this day, the debate continues on what, besides loyalty to the monarch, defines a Cavalier poet. In the 1970s, Earl Minor proposed a new way of looking at the Cavaliers in his essay, The Cavalier Ideal of the Good Life. Instead of using a timeline or looking at poetic form or meter, Minor urges that the Cavaliers are united around a common goal, the desire to explore the elements that made up happiness and the good life. Minor notes that, quote, Cavalier social values are those of an aristocracy and gentry that 2 centuries before might have struggled against the throne, but that now sought to protect the king for all his faults against his enemies and to preserve crown, mitre, estates, and what was often termed our liberties. Unquote. Though disparate in their backgrounds, beliefs, meter, and form, the Cavalier poets shared a common aesthetic, this idea of the good life. The elements of this bonum vitae can be summed up in a conservative outlook, a response to a social threat, classical recollections, love of a very English way of life, and a new blending of old ideas. All of these features reveal a consistent urge to define and explore the features of what constituted human happiness. Right at the center of this coalescence of ideas sits the country house poem. What better way is there to look back on the past, aristocratic ideals, and conservative principles than in praising a country seat? This paper aims to expand on Earl Minor's idea of the Cavalier ideal of the good life, particularly as it relates to the country house poem, by showing that the description of Cookham by Amelia Lanier and a description of an island by Margaret Cavendish both fall into the category of Cavalier poetry as proposed by Earl Minor. The most famous country house poem is likely Ben Jonson's To Penshurst, which Mary Ann McGuire says is, quote, a paean to the traditional patterns of estate life, unquote, which were being threatened during the early 17th century. However, there are many other poems, not directly about country houses, that nevertheless fit within the country house genre. Minor points to Robert Herrick's A Thanksgiving to God for His House as an example of his idea of bonum vitae. Minor's comments on the piece highlight its place within both the genre of country house poems and the Cavalier ideal of the good life. The snug house, the fire loved by the Cavaliers, the good food and abundant drink, all these things made up the good life for which Herrick pays God due thanks. The years leading up to the English Civil War and the years following were years of political and social unrest, and the country house that looms large in Cavalier poetry was truly an escape, a fortress of calm in the chaos. Maguire says that the country house represented a private stronghold within which aristocratic comforts and powers can be preserved against a rising tide of opposition. As a note, the term Cavalier poet may be surprising in the case of Lanier, who would have been around 56 years old when the first Charles took the throne. However, Ben Jonson is commonly grouped with the Cavalier poets, and he was only 3 years younger. So Lanier's timeline should not prove a problem for this categorization. Poetic content and style, I believe, are better indicators of the Cavalier label than just timeline. So first, let's look at Lanier's description of Cookham. The description of Cookham, written by Amelia Lanier, a lesser-known female poet, is the first recorded country house poem. While Minor focuses solely on male poets, Lanier's poem has many of the signifiers present in Cavalier poetry and falls into Minor's category of poems seeking the good life. Lanier exemplifies this Cavalier trait of a new blending of old ideas in her treatment of the blazon and Petrarchan poetic conceits. Blazon poetry was a categorization and description of parts of the beloved's body by the lover, but Lanier uses this form to describe a house instead of a person. Each part did seem some new delight to frame. The house received all ornaments to grace it, and would endure no foulness to deface it, lines 18 through 20. Just as the lover was wont to describe the perfection of each part of his beloved, so Lanier describes the perfection of the estate's parts. The words ornaments here is likewise noteworthy, as ornamentation could refer to the decoration of a house or to ornamental jewelry worn by a human. Indeed, the first definition of ornament in the Oxford English Dictionary highlights this overlap. According to the OED, an ornament is defined as either an accessory or adjunct, primarily functional, but often also fancy or decorative, in plural, equipment, trappings, furniture, attire. Directly after the passage above, we are given a description of the ornaments that Cookham wears. The walks put on their summer liveries, and all things else did hold like similes. The trees with leaves, with fruits, with flowers clad, embraced each other, seeming to be glad, turning themselves to beauteous canopies to shade the bright sun from your brighter eyes, lines 21 through 26. In this passage, there is a double invocation of Petrarch. First, in the blazon-like mode of describing each part of nature around Cookham, and secondly, in the allusion to the Countess's eyes being brighter than the sun. Of all the similes associated with Petrarch, this is surely one of the most well-known, and its inclusion here reinforces the supposition that we are encouraged to view Cookham in Petrarchan terms, the very exemplar of doing new things with old forms. Another aspect of Cavalier poetry, according to Minor, is the use of classical allusions. These can be seen in Lanier's poetry in the Petrarchan ideals expressed above, but it is also evident in imagery evoking man's golden age, a trope of classical poetry. Maguire notes that this golden age ideal is expressed in country house poems by the prosperity of the estate, resulting not only from interpersonal harmony between landlord and tenants, but also from a harmony between man and nature, which is presented as a congenial force that cooperates with man's agriculture efforts without being violated by human art. This congeniality between humans and nature is woven throughout the poem and evident by the manner in which nature seems intent on putting forth its best for the benefit of the Countess. The crystal streams with silver spangles grace, while by this glorious sun they were embraced. The little birds in chirping notes did sing, to entertain both you and that sweet spring, lines 27 through 30. Like Johnson's to Penshurst or Carey's to Saxham, the perfection of nature is so hyperbolic that it appears ridiculous. But this hyperbole was a key part of country house poems. Speaking of the Croft family who owned Saxham, Maguire writes, their special status is described in hyperbole as an exemption from natural law. While other mortals must accept climactic and diurnal changes, the Crofts live in an eternal spring and enjoy an endless day, unmarred by nightfall. Like the Croft, the Countess in Lanier's poem also reaches this semi-immortal status. Her nature in the poem appears as a powerful mixture of mythological goddess and Virgin Mary-esque saint. All nature honors her with its best ornaments. Each arbor, bank, each seat, each stately tree thought themselves honored in supporting thee. The pretty birds would oft come to attend thee, yet fly away for fear they should offend thee. The little creatures in the burrow by would come abroad to sport them in your eye, yet fearful of the bow in your fair hand, lines 45 to 51. The Countess here appears an ancient goddess. The woods array themselves for her pleasure, and nature trembles in fear of the bow in her hand, likely an evocation of Diana, goddess of the hunt. This description of plenty and peace should remind us of Minor's categorization of Cavalier poetry, in which the ideal of the bonum vitae focused on these very things. Yet pagan myths are not the only classical recollections evident in this poem. There are many biblical allusions as well, and Maguire notes that these served as an important social role in country house poems. Speaking of Cary's similar flattery of the Croft family in his poem, Maguire writes that to develop further his insistence on the Crofts' special position as members of a privileged elite, Cary introduces a set of biblical allusions. Lanier, like Cary, alludes to a slew of biblical figures midway through the poem. With Moses you did mount the holy hill, to know his pleasure and perform his will. With lowly David you did often sing his holy hymns to heaven's eternal King. And in sweet music did your soul delight, to sound his praises morning, noon, and night. With blessed Joseph you did often feed your pined brethren when they stood in need. All of nature comes together in harmony and supports aristocratic prerogative in the person of the Countess. Cookham, like Penshurst or Saxham, includes notions of noblesse oblige, that is, the responsibility the members of the nobility have towards those less fortunate. Lanier herself is an example of this idea. The Countess to whom she writes this poem was her friend and patroness, and she was able to stay at Cookham through the generosity of the Countess's family. As Maguire notes, the property owner used his estate as a vehicle for expressing his aristocratic liberality and his noblesse oblige, in this case hers, since he was expected to hold open house for all comers, to contribute lavishly to charity, and to maintain a large household that included numerous servants and retainers. Minor emphasized the importance of the aristocracy, gentry, and nobility in his essay on the Cavaliers, and this ideal is demonstrated in Lanier's poem, not only by the societal and natural peace accompanying her presence, but by the disastrous consequence of her absence. The second half of the poem is dedicated to what might be called an anti-blazon. All the parts of Cookham wither without the presence of the Countess. Like the lover apart from his mistress in a Petrarchan sonnet, Cookham mourns, sickens, and dies. And you, sweet Cookham, whom these ladies leave, I now must tell the grief you did conceive. At their departure, when they went away, how everything retained a sad dismay, lines 126 through 130. The trees which in the Countess's presence shaded her with their leaves, forsook both flower and fruit at the news of her departure, and their very leaves did wither, changing their colors as they grew together. Like the abandoned lover, Cookham's winter has come when the Countess departs. Let us now turn to Margaret Cavendish's A Description of an Island. Lanier is not the only female poet of the 17th century whose poetry fits within Minor's definition of the bonum vitae of the Cavalier poets. Lady Margaret Cavendish was almost a generation younger than Lanier, but her royalist tendencies and membership in the Cavalier aristocracy align her closely with Cavalier sensibilities. Though many of her poems borrow heavily from Donne and the metaphysical poets, Cavendish's poem, A Description of an Island, evokes Lanier's work and plays with the idea of the country house poem by expanding it to include the entire island of Great Britain. The title of Cavendish's poem should instantly put us in mind of Lanier's. Unlike the perfunctory to Penshurst or to Saxham, the use of the word description creates a titular bridge between the two poems. Cavendish, like Lanier, uses all of Minor's Cavalier tropes, including Golden Age imagery, classical recollections, importance of societal order and communal ties, noblesse oblige, and a new working of old ideas. Cavendish begins the poem by trying to fit it into the country house tradition, by tying it into the country house poem tradition. The island is ringed with waves, strong as a wall to keep her foes without, line 14. A fortress in the storm, just like Cookham and the other country houses. Just as the trees and shrubs of Cookham attire themselves as retainers for the Countess, so the winds in Cavendish's poem act as servants to the island. The winds did serve her, and on clouds did ride, blowing their trumpets loud on every side, lines 15 and 16. The descriptions of nature that follow are strikingly similar to both Lanier's poem and the other country house poems, and can be seen in passages such as the following. Trees thrived with joy, for she their roots well fed, and tall with pride their tops did overspread, danced with the winds when they did sing and blow, lines 25 through 27. This passage from Cavendish's poem expresses the joy of nature, and of trees particularly, in a manner that should bring the following passage from Lanier's poem to mind. The trees with leaves, with fruits, with flowers clad, embraced each other, seeming to be glad. Birds and flowers in both poems join in the joy of the trees, which, as Maguire reminded us above, is included to demonstrate the virtue of the owners of the estate, be it house or island. The trees in Lanier's poems are arrayed in honor of the Countess, but Lanier invokes the Golden Age imagery even more strongly in her poem, rather Cavendish does, by making the master of this island Apollo Great himself. Rumrich's text, which is the one I used, glosses Apollo simply as the sun, but it would take no stretch of interpretation to draw the line between Cavendish's depiction of Apollo and Charles I. The allusions to crowns in line 45 could easily be a reference to either Charles, as could the ruler's role as the ruler of the island. If this is the case, the poem's tone matches Minor's cavalier ideal of society, blessed by a well-ordered and virtuous, even divine elite. The ideals of noblesse oblige are represented in Cavendish's poem in a similar manner to those in Cary's De Saxum. About this notion in Cary's poem, Maguire writes that Cary does, however, present Saxum as a vehicle for expressing the expected gestures of noblesse oblige. In a metaphor that Cary develops at some length, Saxum is treated as a beacon of light and warmth in a cold, dark world. The Crofts maintain Saxum as an island of light, securely separated from surrounding darkness. Whereas Saxum is metaphorically an island of light in a dark world, England in Cavendish's poem works on both the literal and figurative level. In Cavendish's island, the days are always comfortable, without the harsh summer and winter of the surrounding world. Temperate seasons gave, and equal lights, warm sunshine days, and dewy moonshine nights, lines 81 and 82. This idea is expressed in Lanier's poem and in Cary's. Using a standard conceit, they emphasize that while winter reigns outdoors, the household experiences indoors the warmth and comfort of a perennial spring, so full of native sweets that bless thy roof with inward happiness. It is a paradise within, immune to both natural adversity of inclement weather and to the vagaries of socio-political climate. Under the rule of Apollo and the female personification of the isle, virtue and plenty reign unchecked. And yet, like in Lanier's poem, all this beautiful and harmonious nature falls apart when the nobility leave. Cavendish wrote a sequel poem to the first titled The Ruin of This Island. As the title indicates, the poem describes not the joy and harmony of the island basking in Apollo's golden beams, but an island desolate because it drove away its virtuous ruler. Where Lanier's poem looks with dread at the departure of the nobility, Cavendish looks back at the reality of the disastrous Civil War and the chaos and destruction that befell England when the nobility was driven away. Maguire notes that the country house poem assumed a correlation between property ownership and the virtue of the owner. An aristocrat defined himself by fulfilling a tradition of gracious country living that had its origins in the realities of feudal existence. Cavendish clearly does not value the aristocracy for its own sake, but as a necessary part of a moral and orderly society. When this necessary part of a moral order leaves, chaos and ruin ensue. The title Cavalier Poet covers a wide range of individuals, yet these poets are united in their search for happiness. This happiness, based in the ideals of the good life, are exemplified by the English country house, its ancient doors flung wide in a gesture of noblesse oblige, a warm light suffusing its perpetually summer woods, inhabited by virtuous and hospitable gentry. Though female and therefore excluded from Johnson's coterie, both Lanier and Cavendish show many traits of the Cavalier poet, and their description poems illustrate Minor's Cavalier ideal. Whether at Cookham or on Cavendish's figurative island, the bonum vitae can be found only in the habitations of the elite, where the virtuous gentry suffer no foulness to deface it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meg. That was lovely. I think, unless I'm mistaken, that Kevin has not been able to join us. Am I right in that?
Unfortunately, we cannot locate Kevin at this time, so.
Okay. So in keeping with both our papers that we have had this morning, that leaves us with a kind of abundance of time for questions and answers. So thank you both for being so courteous to one another and to everyone else and keeping to your time, but now we can luxuriate a bit in your papers. Does anyone have a question with which they'd like to begin?
I do. I have a thank you for both of these excellent papers. I was luxuriating in the papers themselves, just revisiting favorite texts and being given some fresh perspectives on them. Question for Nick. I'm Chris Hodgkins, by the way, from North Carolina, Greensboro. Your comments on the Forest of Arden as this healing place, which is in a way an extension of the court, a place for setting things right, I thought was very, very accurate. I wonder if you could reflect, though, on another great comedy in the forest where there certainly are healing qualities and things come right because of the time of the forest, but there's also madness and danger, and that's Midsummer Night's Dream. That is wood within this wood, right? The word wood, as most of us probably have heard by now, is a word for insanity in the era. And there is plenty of dangerous insanity, even attempted rape and all kinds of other threatened violence, which is finally avoided. Some thoughts on that wood in comparison to Arden and some of these other kinder, gentler woods.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think I would sort of approach it from 2 points of view. One would be sort of in terms of the violence, who's bringing the violence into the wood, right? A lot of that is Demetrius and sort of the disordered heart that he has before the whole story begins with his, conflicted feelings for Hermia and Helena. And then the other would be the role of the supernatural is so much stronger in Midsummer. So I would be wanting to spend, and I haven't done the work yet, but I'd be very curious of the way in which the fairies in some way enable or highlight that danger, not because they're within the forest, but because of their role as being outside the natural order in some sort of capacity. And then even so, because it's a comedy, I sort of have this, in my favor, where everything does end up okay. Even for the muddy middle, it's hard to deny that there's a happy ending.
If I could just follow up quickly on that, another play that you may want to consider in, of course, a larger discussion is The Tempest, where this would help you to make your point, where the villains are hearing all kinds of hostility around them in the woods, whereas the more admirable characters look around and they feel and see benevolence and healing qualities. And so it's, in a sense, what you're bringing into the woods, perhaps.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I think that Kevin is actually with us. So slight change of plans or change of course. But if I could just, while Kevin is,
Yay!
hi Kevin, turning on his video, if I could just follow up with one thing that Chris said, Nick, while I'm thinking of it. I'm reminded of Titania and her description of her dispute between herself and Oberon and the kind of response of the natural world. And at the end of that long speech that she makes, she says something like their argument is the author of all that natural disorder. So I would be curious when we, World Enough in Time, how that might fit into your argument.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Great. Okay, I'm going to turn things over now to Kevin. We're so glad to see you.
I'm so sorry about that. One of the, I guess, things with the virtual conference that I forgot to double check is time zone. So I was about to sign on in a couple minutes and got the emails, and I'm very, very sorry, but
no
glad
worries.
I could.
We just went ahead to questions, and now the floor shall be yours.
And
Okay.
we should
Introduction.
apologize to you for not emphasizing the time zones.
We should have done that.
Should we do this in the future?
Yeah, lesson learned. Lesson learned.
Well, thank you. So I guess I'll just get started with the paper right away. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about science and the style of Du Bartas's Divine Weeks in translation. So in the past 2 decades, John Milton's Paradise Lost has found itself at the center of scholarship focused both on ecology and science in the early modern period. Milton, in fact, has become celebrated as something of a proto-environmentalist, perhaps even an experimental philosopher. Milton's epic has proven so rich for these intersecting fields, of course, because it derives from the period's central text for understanding humanity's relationship to nature, from Genesis. The scriptural account of creation, too, has been crucial for eco-studies of the early modern period, particularly as critics examined issues of human dominion and natural knowledge. Creation in this scholarship has proved fruitful grounds for scholars interested in thinking through the entanglements between early modern religion, the new philosophy, and the ecological outlook of both early moderns and ourselves. Less attention, however, has been devoted to the environmental outlook of the other massively popular epic of creation in early modernity, Du Bartas's La Semaine, known often in England through Josua Sylvester's translation, The Divine Weeks and Works. If mentioned at all, Du Bartas is generally held up as a retrogressive example against which to illuminate Milton's achievements, as in Karen Edwards' account of Milton's natural history. And certainly, the epic is often conservative and reactionary, as in its condemnation of Copernican astronomy.